Let me first of all thank the organizers for inviting me for this opportunity. I will share with you some impressions stemming from my stay in Abkhazia. There was a period of 6 months in last year, but I will contextualize these observations with some case studies from Georgia. First of all, I'm going to read out a text, which you can also find in the internet. It is uploaded, kindly enough, by the Heinrich Boell Foundation. So if you don't follow everything with me right now when I'm talking, because it's a bit of a dense text and it's a pretty anthropological text, then you have a chance to take a look at the website, where you will also find the Georgian version. And I'm also very honored that there will be a Georgian simultaneous translation. So for all of you who feel more comfortable following me in Georgian, please go ahead and pick up some of these funky microphones. So as I said, I will first read out the text. And after having done that, I will raise some issues that could also serve as issues to be discussed during the discussion. And then, of course, you are very free to ask me all kinds of questions you have in mind concerning me or concerning my presentation. Walking down the street, we meet a man of about 50 years in a black suit with a badge depicting a faded image of his mother who had died a few years ago on his shirt. He immediately starts talking about God, that he seeks him, that people need him, that he hopes to find him. I first believed to have a Jehovah's Witness in front of me, but then he seems like too many questions and too few certainties. Later we learn that he lives alone in a village after his mother had passed away, and that during the war, one of his ears was cut off as he was presumed dead. Ears were cut off for trophies. This note is included in my diary for August 2017, when I visited a town whose name is being disputed. Some call it Gal and see it as the westernmost city of Abkhazia. Others call it Gali and thus perceive it as a Georgian city because, as you all know, the I is the nominative ending of Georgian nouns. Its population was displaced by Abkhazian troops after they had won a war against Georgia in the autumn of 1993. Violence came suddenly, unexpectedly, and massively. People had to flee overnight. The expulsion was based on Abkhazian troops and leaders' distrust of the loyalty of the population of Gal/E that almost completely consisted, and nowadays again consists, of Megrelians. They, the Megrelians, speak a language related to Georgian, and most of them live on Georgian territory across the border. As a second language, almost all Megrelians speak Georgian, the language of the enemy, from the Abkhaz perspective. In the second half of the 1990s, shortly after their cleansing, a large number of Megrelians were able to return to their destroyed homes. The distrust of the Abkhazians towards the Megrelians, however, remains lively still today. Abkhazian police patrol the streets. Megrelians are not recruited. Megrelians are denied Abkhazian passports unless they profess to have been originally Abkhazian and Megrelianized later on. In 2014, Megrelians residing in Abkhazia were deprived of the right to vote. The Georgian government speaks of apartheid. And in 2015, the Georgian language was banned from usage in the schools of Gal/E. Despite their poor command, Megrelian children thus have to study school subjects in the Russian language. Georgians too distrust Megrelians, at least some do, because their group provides numerous features that could justify national independence. A separate language, a fairly clearly demarcated settlement area, periods of political sovereignty. For this reason, Georgian scholars attach great importance to concepts. Whereas the Georgians are considered an ethnic group, the Megrelians are labeled as a sub-ethnic, ethnographic, or ethno-territorial group. for example, by the eminent Georgian ethnographer Georgi Chitaya, who prefers the notion of sub-ethnicity. Beyond academic concerns, the crucial issue here is that ethnic groups may become a nation and claim sovereignty according to international law, whereas groups allocated below the threshold of ethnicity may not, because they already belong to a at least potential nation. As an ethnic group with their own language, some may fear, Megrelians may well claim sovereignty outside of the confines of the Georgian state, and this claim would be difficult to dismiss on scholarly grounds. The background to these concerns is separatism that has led to the de facto independence and statehood of Abkhazia and to a lesser extent of South Ossetia. It is these concerns that have motivated some Georgian scholars to state that Megrelians speak a dialect of Georgian, not a language, although the vast majority of linguists worldwide disagree. In the district of Gal/E, mistrust is omnipresent, mutual, and reciprocal. The reciprocity of mistrust perpetuates the latter and creates spirals of suspicion that are almost impossible to escape. When mistrust encounters itself, it tends to intensify and solidify, like aggression aggravates in situations of war. Yet the citizens of Gal/E have to find ways to get along with the presence of others they distrust and that distrust them. One coping strategy is to allocate the core of mistrust beyond subjective accountability. Instead of blaming the people in one's surrounding personally for the unbearable situation, one may assume that there is something else beyond the surface, an unknown essence that drives it all and that causes mistrust to spread. So the next section is called Conspiracy Theories. Visiting a Megrelian family in Gal/E. Georgi, a Megrelian nationalist, is seated next to me. For him, the first kingdom of the Megrelians, Caucasus, represents the origin of Georgian statehood. Only the Megrelians and what he calls the hill tribes, so-called ethnic groups of Georgian highlanders such as Tushetians, Swans or Khefsurs, are true Georgians, he postulates. The others are a mixture of Georgians, Armenians and Azerbaijanis. He has learned Abkhazian as a child and has Abkhazian friends. In front of me are two Abkhazians who speak Abkhazian among themselves and Russian with the others. In order to explain how the war between Georgia and Abkhazia came about, Georgi tells a story he attributes to the Georgian nobleman Sulkhan Sabo Orbeliani. And the story goes as following. A pig lives with its piglets at the foot of a tree on which an eagle nests. Comes a fox and says to the pig, "Do not leave the tree, the eagle is just waiting to kill your piglets." Then he goes to the eagle and says, "Do not fly away. The pig is just waiting to gnaw the root of the tree until it falls over." The pig and the eagle no longer leave the tree. The first piglet dies from hunger and is fetched by the fox. The first chick dies from hunger and is fetched by the fox. At the end, everyone is dead and the fox has filled its stomach. End of the story. Georgi explained a third force is at work here which whispers, incites, and only pursues its own interests. This force was behind the war in Abkhazia. This force is behind everything. Jews, Freemasons. End of quote. Such narratives allow living with those who distrust you because they are not held responsible for the distrust. And one can agree with them about invisible enemies who are to be blamed for it all. Later on, I note, quote, many conspiracy theories. Armenians, Jews, Freemasons are guilty of everything, but one cannot see them and there is no evidence. A hidden power that, like God, works in secret. End of quote. As much as these conspiracy theories are based on demonizing groups as Freemasons, Jews, or Armenians, with potentially most harmful consequences such as pogroms, ethnic cleansing, shootings, incarceration, gasification, etc., they are not least ways of getting along with the own others, who are apparently, so it seems, not responsible, just like oneself. Thus, conspiracy theories may open up a shared space, a space that potentially nurtures conviviality, if only in its most basic form. It is the comfort of commonly perceived enemies, as Asmussen would put it, that conspiracy theories provide. The secret others become scapegoats, and their joint blaming creates commonality. A bit earlier, I had already penciled down, quote, "A lot of talk about God here, the quest for God, the only one who proves meaning to life," end of quote. This entry was not merely about the man in black we met on the street, but also about David, our host. The next section is called Looking Behind Things. David has fled to Georgia during the Abkhaz War, spent several years there, and intended to stay. In 2001, however, he returned to Gal/E because his father had passed away and David had to take over his position as head of household. Quote, "God had other plans for me," unquote. Professionally, he works as a bank accountant. David is unmarried and possesses a key to the church. When taking me along to the church, he points to an icon of St. George in a corner of the church and explains, quote, so he's explaining the icon to me now. "In the right top corner, there is God, whose light falls on George. George is a saint who guides the people, symbolized by the horse he rides on. People are both good and evil, so they need divine guidance. The dragon that George kills, creeping at his feet, is just evil. On this icon, the flakes of the dragon are painted in bright colors. Did you notice that George wears the same colors in his robe? This is because he has to know evil in order to defeat it." End of quote. The latter reference emphasizes the life-worldly importance of practical knowledge, which is not acquired by observation from a distance, but by taking part. Such knowledge requires the engagement with a world that cannot be trusted. For David, this dirty knowledge is more profound than secular knowledge derived from a safe distance. At the same time, he pays close attention to natural phenomena such as the position of the sun or its rays. He has stored several photographs of the sun on his phone, even more of stones from a nearby forest. "There is a place," explains David, "where two rivers come together, a place he usually visits with his confessor. The water has a very special composition and is not drinkable. No frogs live in the water, there is no living being around, all is quiet." This is where David detects stones consisting of a cosmic material and marked by signs, some looking like a star chart, others like faces. David is fascinated by the regularity and symmetry of these signs, which to him indicate that these stones were inscribed by humans and derived from prehistoric times, in his words, when the dinosaurs were still alive. For him, these artifacts are facts he can stick to which at the same time testify to a higher power, an ancient lost knowledge, and cosmic energies or substances. On one of the many photographs he took of the stones, a small folding rule is placed next to the object. On others, he holds a square angle to the stone in order to illustrate its perfect proportions. On a portrait depicting him with a stone in his hand, an inexplicable light appears on his back. David has tried to find archaeologists to study these stones, their effect and location, but in vain. For him, the messages are evident, but for others they are hidden. Perhaps they can only be seen by those who have learned to look behind things. Religions are cults of mistrust, as they do not accept things or people for what they seem to be. In this sense, conspiracy theories can be construed as religious, as they too represent powers as concealed. In places like Gal/E, where insecurity is endemic, such concealed powers are everywhere, and they haunt. Even time cannot be trusted in Abkhazia. On mobile phones and computers that receive data from the internet, it is 1 hour earlier than on mechanical watches. The internet forces the Abkhazians into a time zone that for them has expired, the time zone of Georgia. Abkhazia is not recognized under international law, thus Abkhazian time is not accepted in virtual space. Abkhazia has fallen out of time. So the next section is called Facade Politics. There is also the suspicious assumption that there is nothing behind observable reality. Everything is just a facade. By means of such facades, revolutionary projects occasionally indicate the beginning of a new era. One such project was the peaceful Rose Revolution in Georgia in November 2003. With the overthrow of the then President Shevardnadze, the post-Soviet period was declared to have come to an end. A society would emerge that freed itself from the shackles of the past. It would go from darkness to light quite literally. In the more than 10 years since independence, the frequent power cuts turned the lights off. Now Georgia would shine. The remodeling of Georgia started with fountains being dressed in pastel colors. Then the TV tower in the Georgian capital Tbilisi glittered like a Christmas tree. With the arrival of the former US President George W. Bush for a state visit in 2005, the apartment buildings adjacent to the airport were freshly painted. Blue and red rays of light illuminated the facades of old city houses along the city walls at night. After the advent of light and colors, it was the time of balconies and cobblestones. The popular old town of Tbilisi, depicted in numerous novels and repeatedly painted or photographed, became the role model. From now on, every Georgian town would need a historic center with balconies and cobblestones. A large sum of money was invested in the development of Sirnari, a fortress town built on the mountainside overlooking the Caucasian mountain ridge. After cobblestonization and balkanization, this small town developed into the most popular tourist destination in the Georgian countryside. For Georgians, Sirnari now symbolizes regional development in the form of musealization. For tourists, it's a symbol of Georgian authenticity. In 2007, I visited a winemaker who works in a wine cellar in the neighboring town of Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv too has undergone a renovation of its ancient center. Traditionally, there were no balconies in the center at all, but now they are attached to many facades. Asphalt roads have been torn up and then paved. Shops, cafes, guest houses, and a center for tourist information have opened. Nevertheless, at least in 2007, when I visited Tel Aviv, there were hardly any visitors. Tel Aviv at that moment was a ghost town. Perhaps spirits can work miracles and convey a sense of presence where before there was nothing, I was speculating. The winemaker waved this off. Against the polished facades of the renovated center, it would become even more apparent how poorly people live. No state funds have reached them. Quote, "It's like in the Soviet Union, just to show." End of quote. The comparison with the Soviet Union makes the post-Soviet economy of Georgia look like a planned economy. What matters is what is in the plan, what can be sold to the media and celebrated on public events. In this vein, the Tbilisi airport was built at record-breaking speed, but once opened, its roof began to leak. And 100 hospitals were officially inaugurated within 3 years, from 2007 to 2010, but their equipment was driven from here to there, depending on the schedule of press conferences organized to document the opening of a hospital. In the Soviet Union, the realization of plans had also been detached from reality, dramatically so and with substantial consequences. Those who, like the economist Alexander Chayanov, held on to the power of the factual and empirically based analysis for the development of economy had to reckon with exile and death during the early Soviet years. This procedure was successful to the extent that during the late years of the Soviet Union, facts and empiricism became largely irrelevant. there was no longer anything below the surface. Instead, the surface was employed as a material that could be manipulated and ironized, as Jurčák describes in his book. In post-Soviet Georgia, too, there is nothing behind the facades. So at least many Georgians assume. The role model for the faking of reality is not so much the Soviet Union, however, but rather Imperial Russia with its impression policy. The painted apartment blocks close to the airport, the facades of cracking old Tbilisi houses bathed in flashy colors, hospitals with no equipment, all this rather evokes the image of Potemkin villages. These fake villages, allegedly, for it may be a rumor, built by Grigory Potemkin for Catherine the Great in 1787, represent grandezza without substance, serving to hide an undesirable presence. And it is this kind of impression management which became paradigmatic under the label of Potemkin villages that is at stake in post-Soviet Georgia as well. Mistrust here asks for the substance. The next section is called ruins, and you see loads of them on the pictures, all taken in Abkhazia. In Abkhazia as well, there is nothing behind some facades, but for another reason. Many buildings have been destroyed during the war with Georgia and not been renovated yet, or only poorly so. Doric columns that have nothing to support, windows through which one can see the sky from the street, bullet holes in the walls. In several cases, the facades are deliberately left standing. The 12-story former government seat that had caught fire due to army shelling during the war, for example, remains as a ruin in the center of the Abkhazian capital. In front, an empty pedestal on which Lenin once stood. Places like these are embodiments of horror that work as a reminder to the Abkhaz citizenry of a past that is yet a presence. In most other cases, however, the reason for the existence of ruins of seriously dilapidated buildings is much more straightforward. Lack of financial means to do something with the facades. Obviously, there is nothing behind them. No intention, no excuse, no deception. No mistrust is required to observe this. Railway stations built as places for the travelers fall into disrepair, as do factory buildings, mining shafts, and conveyor belts. Mining towns have turned into ghost towns. As their architecture is pompous, the effects of decay are even stronger. These sites, however, attract tourists from Western Europe to Abkhazia and serve to illustrate their travelogues to the internet. On Georgian facades with nothing behind, the future should shine, a colorful, happy, somewhat loony future. They are inscribed with a fictional, temporal dimension. On Abkhazian facades, likewise with nothing behind, there is no discernible future, only a past as war, or a present as absence. If statehood is built on citizens' confidence in the future, then this confidence is shaken here, and thus statehood subverted on a most basic level. This lack of faith in the capacity of the state to shape the future is not limited to Abkhazia or other post-Soviet societies, of course. It is also a symptom for the West, at least since the proclaimed end of history after the collapse of the Soviet Union. It's Fukuyama who came up with this claim. With no future ahead, the future now takes place in the past, captured in outdated utopias such as those of state socialism. This is one of the reasons why places like Abkhazia are so attractive to Western visitors. It is here they can encounter a past future. It radiates from the Soviet mosaics and conjures up the departure into space or utopia on Earth. If there wasn't this suspicion that this future has expired, one would want to join these travels too. The next section is called NGO politics. Business or betrayal? Such is the question asked by Temur Koduri in an entry on Facebook dated 24 July 2017. The author is concerned about the involvement of his Abkhaz compatriots in an international project to preserve the Abkhaz language. The project is coordinated by the Georgian-based Center for Civil Integration and Interethnic Relations and funded by US aid. The participating linguists hail from the University of Frankfurt. The local partner is the Association of Businesswomen of Abkhazia. In his post, Kodori mentions the name of the participants as well as the amount of money they received. He then raises the question whether the Abkhazians involved in this project had been bribed by the opponents of Abkhazia. Quote, "How soon will Abkhazia lose its independence as a result of such an approach and again become an appendix of Georgia?" End of quote. Another indicator of betrayal is, according to Kodori, the fact that the Abkhaz participants have accepted to be photographed in front of a logo showing Abkhazia within the confines of Georgia. This logo is part of the corporate design of the Georgian NGO responsible for the project. The homepage of this NGO does not mention this project, however, not even in the annual reports produced during the project term 2015-2016. And maybe it is no coincidence that the current projects section of the NGO's homepage was adjusted on 25 July 2017, one day after Kodori's post. On the websites of those involved in Frankfurt and Abkhazia too, not a single word can be found about this project. Only the donor, the USAID-sponsored donor, has published the following description. And here I quote from the website. "The aim of this project is to support the interpersonal reconciliation between Georgians and Abkhazians by protecting and promoting the endangered Abkhaz language. This goal will be achieved by, first, mobilizing the Georgian and Abkhazian representatives of science and civil society through the common interest in treasuring and revitalizing the Abkhaz language. Second, bringing together young people, the potential leaders of Abkhazia and Georgia, to represent and promote universal human values, as well as encouraging mutual respect, tolerance, and a peaceful neighborhood. And three, to facilitate a meaningful dialogue between various social groups regarding issues of common interest, for example, education, science, and the promotion of joint cooperation." End of quote. So this is, as I said, it's a quotation I took from the website of USAID, which also miraculously disappeared. So now there is no trace of this quote and no more reference to this project whatsoever on the website. In addition to the promotion of cooperation, this project concerns the creation of an Abkhazian language corpus and the development of software for the linguistic processing of the Abkhaz language. The required material is provided by Abkhazians, among them writers, the scientific expertise by the specialists from Frankfurt. Abkhazian linguists are not part of this cooperation, although they too are working on the documentation of the Abkhazian language and on concepts for its promotion. A linguist and teacher of Abkhaz based in the Abkhazian capital, who authored one of the few textbooks available, has never heard of this project. A linguist from the Abkhaz Academy of Sciences, actually also the former foreign minister of Abkhazia, never heard of this project from his dentist. The form of collaboration this project promotes is thus asymmetric. One party delivers, the other understands. This colonial form of knowledge production confirms the mistrust of those who feel that Abkhazia is not taken seriously. In this way, mistrust perpetuates and intensifies the rejection to work with colleagues from abroad, as cooperation is never assumed to take place among equals. A great deal of energy is needed for mistrustful engagements with external actors energy many Abkhazians lack after decades of isolation, stagnation, and depression. Better not having anything to do with something one cannot trust and that can be avoided. Given the clouds under which the project is shrouded, another mistrust finds substantiation. One should not see what it's all really about. Once again, mistrust is ignited by surfaces. Instead of assuming that all there is are facades with no substance behind, the suspicious assumption here is that there is something hidden behind the facade, namely a political agenda based on hostile intentions. On the surface, one can see NGO-driven civic engagements, presumably without a political purpose and directed towards a universal good. In this case, the preservation, documentation, and promotion of the Abkhaz language. Underneath the surface, however, a doubtful observer, such as Timur Kodori, identifies a dark force, here incorporated by the Georgian state and its allies. In order for this force to work, so Kodori implies, it has to come in disguise. This disguise is provided by the NGOs involved in this project, which are essentially machinations of masquerade. For Kodori, the research project is just a cover-up of political infiltration and indoctrination. In the Russian-speaking world, that includes Abkhazia, such activity is covered by the word pakazukha, which refers to putting on a false show to cover up the actual state of affairs. And it's quite interesting, and we could maybe talk about that pakazukha, is part of the Georgian language as well, right? For example, you could say about politicians, pakazukha biarian. So there is something interesting going on here with this notion, which has to do with the surface and pretension, and which also captures a certain sense of mistrust, I would say. So that's something we could discuss or get into during the discussion. But let's get back to pakazukha. The aim of the show is to represent a presence that isn't real and a reality that is not meant to be present. Trusting the visible would mean to be trapped in illusion and to fall victim to deceit. The distrust that Kodori articulates is meant to make the show fall apart. Now my final section, which is a bit of a conclusion, is called Distrusting Facades. In many of the cases portrayed above, facades have aroused suspicion. In the case of Georgian facade politics, the suspicion is that there is nothing behind, that the surface is all there is. This absence of substance comes in stark contrast to the message that is conveyed with these facades, that of a presence, of a thriving life, of a future and a succeeding present. In the case of Abkhazian facades, that are often those of ruins, the absence of something behind, at the same time denotes an absence of the future. This absence of the future is, in a way, the essence of Abkhaz ruins. Whereas in the Georgian case, the Potyomkin facades denote an attempt to manipulate public perception, in the Abkhaz case, they denote a void. Facades may also serve to hide a secret agenda. In this vein, Timur Kodori assumes that NGOs occasionally provide the facade behind which a secret political agenda unfolds. He sees the NGOs that he is targeting as Trojan horses that allow the enemy to penetrate one's own space. What he discerns is a contradiction between visible surfaces and what is underneath. Such kind of contradiction may be explained with the help of conspiracy theories. Doing so also allows alleviating tensions with one's neighbors who do not need to be held accountable for past atrocities, because another clandestine power can be blamed instead. In the context of Abkhazia, this discursive strategy fosters conviviality with those that cannot be trusted. The tension that distrust creates is distracted by conjuring up joint enemies, even if fictional ones. Thank you very much for your attention. Right, so this is the text I wanted to read out. I'm eager to hear your questions and your comment. I mean, as a starting point to the discussion, I thought I could raise some issues that pop up during the preparation of this talk and the kind of manufacturing of the text for online publication. It is all online and it looks very nicely, and I'm very thankful to the Heinrich Boell Foundation for this opportunity, also for the Georgian translation. Well, as I said, there were some interesting things going on within the process of preparing that online preparation. One was the title. So I was asked to come up with a title, and as you said, I finally decided to choose Moments of Mistrust in the South Caucasus as a title. Initially, I thought that I could be more explicit and also somehow mention Abkhazia and Georgia as a subtitle, maybe. So my initial proposal was Moments of Mistrust in the South Caucasus, Observations from Georgia and Abkhazia. But then I realized, and it took me some days to realize that this subtitle could be badly misunderstood and interpreted in rather negative ways by contrasting Abkhazia to Georgia, right? And in a way claiming that Abkhazia as a unit, I mean as a word or as a concept exists independently of Georgia. So again, it made me being aware and becoming aware of how sensitive phrasing is in this context, right? And you also noted my clumsy efforts to talk of gal/e. I mean, it goes nicer and it's much easier when writing, right? But when talking, gal/e sounds kind of stupid. And I haven't found a solution to that. I mean, I know that some journalist colleagues and friends of mine who are running OC Media here in Georgia, they chose the policy to simply refer to gal, right? I mean, with a footnote explaining that they just stick to conventions as they are prevalent in Abkhazia for ease of readiness, for convenience sake, actually. So this is one approach. I'm still not decided which approach I am supposed to take, but again, it's the same phenomenon that we are also confronting as with maps, right? I have not yet seen any neutral map depicting the confines of Abkhazia. And I have been part of so many research projects where there have been like serious discussions and severe discussions, maybe sometimes even colleagues claiming that they would leave the research project if the respective map would remain the way it is, right? So it seems to be that there is no neutral way of drawing maps, and there's also no neutral way of phrasing and of using words. I, from my side, I very much sympathize with the usage of the South Caucasus in this context because it's inclusive. And it has some very interesting and positive practical connotations as well. Maybe some of you came across the Chevening Scholarship Program in Great Britain. Why I'm mentioning that, I mean, the interesting and innovative approach of this program is that they allow students from the South Caucasus to enroll by this self-designation as stemming from the South Caucasus. So it actually does allow a small portion of students from Abkhazia to enroll as well. Right, because these students, of course, would not accept to be officially labeled as Georgians, whereas for Georgians it wouldn't be acceptable if they were labeled as Abkhazians. I think it's still a big problem for other funding schemes, as for the German Academic Exchange Service, but I think that in this context, the notion of the South Caucasus provides quite some potential. Although in other frameworks, I'm rather against an excessive usage of the designator South Caucasus because, in a way, it reaffirms political realities. I mean, they are undeniable realities, right? We live in a split world, and we have the North Caucasus, which politically belongs to the Russian Federation. Yes, it's true. But Yen, I mean, my background is anthropology, yes, but also Caucasus studies. So I'm very critical towards dividing the Caucasus as an entity, even if it is a fictional entity, into two halves, thereby not allowing for any ongoing investigations across the border of the North and the South. So that's the first remark towards language and towards the designators we work with. There seems to be no neutral way around, but the South Caucasus as a notion possesses quite some potential. Secondly, Fortunately, there was a chance to illustrate the text by a photo, which brings well, I mean, which evokes some lively images to the rather technical anthropological texts I've been writing. There was an interesting debate as well concerning the capture of the photo. I mean the subtitle of the photo, because initially it said Sukhumi, July 2014, and I just realized it after a couple of days. And I've been going at great length, as I explained, to be neutral in my text and to write off guy/e. So that felt a bit awkward. And honestly, I mean, I want people I know in Abkhazia and also people I do not know in Abkhazia, maybe not to feel comfortable with this text, but not to kind of confront the text and the way it is presented with these very kind of, with these problems that can be avoided, right? So I want them to be able to approach the text and the message without having to kind of, you know, feel uncomfortable about that because it reifies the Georgian way of spelling. So my first proposal was to replace Sochum, it's Sochum with an O initially, with Suchum/E. And this solution or proposal then was apparently communicated to the photographer, and she rather preferred to kind of mention Abkhazia, July 2014 instead, right? Which is fine and which makes sense because it depicts Abkhazia, but it also does depict Sochum/E, right? So there was like a diplomatic way of dealing with that, which again I think points to a certain uneasiness that Georgians may have, right, with this form of Suchum, because it's also U and not O, Sochum/I. I can understand that uneasiness. I can really understand that. And then the third issue concerning the photo, which again I'm very thankful for. It is in a way symptomatic. I don't know if you've seen that, right? It depicts the sea, which of course is one of the most famous sites in Georgia, the seaside, but it's all in gray, right? And we see this one desperate person kind of lingering around, not even at the beach, but rather at some, I don't know exactly what it is, rather some concrete kind of crab, which is situated in the middle of the water. And it looks so depressing, it looks so sad, it looks so gray. And this in a way reifies a certain aesthetical representation of Abkhazia, which is very prominent, right? I've also mentioned those Western tourists whom I've met in Abkhazia who go to completely destroyed places, like this one former mining town close to Tquarchal, which I forgot the name of the mining town now. It's completely in shatters. It looks very sad and very desperate. And people go there for photo tours, right? And it's a bit awkward because a couple of families are still living there. Maybe just 5 or 6 families, right? But there are still people there and some children playing. And then there are these mostly youngsters with great cameras taking photos not only of the dilapidated buildings, but also of those kids playing on the streets, which is not something people are very comfortable with. And usually they try to hinder these kind of captions, right? So, I mean, there is a certain trend to depict Abkhazia this way. And this, of course, comes in a very stark contrast to aesthetical representations of Abkhazia during the Soviet time. When we had the sun, right, we had yellow colors. When we had the sea, like shiny blue colors. When we had green colors of the tropical plants and flowers, right? So there is a shift going on concerning the aesthetic representation of Abkhazia, which is also politicized and which conveys a certain politics of representation, I would say. So that's something I would just want to share with you, right? And in a way, I'm contributing to that because, I mean, I'm showing you ruins, right? I mean, I try to smuggle some a bit nicer pictures into the show as well. But then there is this certain tendency, and me writing about ruins, I contribute to that. So I think it is very important to be conscious about the words we use and the colors we use as well. So these are just my comments, and I'm happy for questions and discussions now.
I'm really glad that you are here, and but you give us this chance. And the second thing is my question. As I saw from your work, you think that the main problem between our people is that there is big mistrust in between us. And from your perspective, what is the fix of this problem? What shall Georgians do to enclave this mistrust between our peoples? Thank you.
Thank you very much for this question. Well, first of all, I'm not arguing that mistrust is the main problem here, because for me, mistrust is not a problem. Mistrust can be used creatively, and mistrust has a constructive potential. And it's precisely this message that I put in the center of the book I am about to publish, which is about mistrust, right? And what I presented to you today is a small chapter of that. Actually, I think that we kind of automatically assume that mistrust is a problem. So we automatically ask for the question, what can be done to overcome this mistrust? Confidence building measures, right? And I'm not saying that it does not make sense, but I am arguing in favor of taking a step back, understanding why people mistrust, what they do when they mistrust. In other words, taking mistrust seriously. So that's really what my book is all about. I try to be, in a way, non-judgmental and try to capture the whole range that mistrust takes. And of course, it can be incredibly harmful and destructive, but not always, right? So I would say that, first of all, we don't automatically have to assume that mistrust is a problem here. My second answer to your question is that, of course, I mean, when we come to talk about the relations between Abkhazians and Georgians, there is a mutual mistrust that maybe could be overcome or maybe could be tackled, right? So you were asking me what could be done to do that. Well, judging from my experience, the program of medical aid has been quite successful, right? I mean, I think you're all familiar with this program, which is running for like 2 years or 3 years or so, that the Georgian state provides free healthcare to Abkhazians. And many Abkhazians went, and many Abkhazians took this opportunity, and that's also a big talk in Abkhazia. And it is a tricky thing because, I mean, if I understand correctly, Abkhaz needs something like an exit visa. It's not called exit visa, but they need something like a permission from the Abkhaz political authorities to leave Abkhaz for Georgia, right? So this, again, could be used to exert pressure on the Abkhaz citizenry, which is bad, which is really bad. And anyhow, I think that exit visas are among the most devilish thing that could be done to citizens, actually. But to a large extent, it is successful, and I know quite a lot of people who actually, I mean, undertook this program and went to Georgia. That even, as a consequence, had the effect that last year, when I spent 6 months in Abkhazia, there was quite some talk that the Russians would want to kind of supplement this with an equal program in Russia. Right? Because, I mean, Russian politicians were understanding that this is becoming popular in Abkhazia and that it attracts people. And it's not only that people go to Georgia for medical treatment, they also see Georgia, right? And my perception always as an outsider, because I'm neither Abkhaz nor Georgian, is that Georgia is at least a dynamic place, right? Things are happening here, whereas Abkhaz is quite a stagnating place. So coming from a stagnating place, going to a dynamic place like Georgia, it will have an effect, right? So I think that confidence-building measures at this kind of level make sense. Sometimes they don't even have to be packed and parceled as a state program, I would say. I've also heard that the famous Basiani Club also attracts youngsters from Sukhum, me, for example, right? So that also has an effect. It just happens. So I would say that it's these kind of things that matter.
So thank you for coming, let's say so. And I'm also a refugee from Abkhazia, so it's like a bonus chapter for me, let's say so, this day, like super invitation. So I was really very interesting about that you mentioned the neutral language. I think it's the most important in this case, because usually almost at least majority of the research that I read and heard about, this is like minority and majority. So are you a Georgian side or a peasant side? So it's really, I think, hard to kind of, as you said, to choose and talk only about like Sukhumi or Sukhum. So, and of course it's anthropological side of it, that you need to be observed and don't like go to the one side of it. But at the same time, don't you think that it makes kind of more messy way, like even this natural language as well? Maybe it's better if we will choose one.
Well, first of all, I think I need to clarify that I did not conduct any particular fieldwork in Abkhazia. It's important to say that, right? Because we have this anthropological ethos of, in the best case, spending a year in the field and being close to locals. And I spent only 6 months in Abkhazia last year, and I spent most of the time writing my book. So I did not do any concerted field work in Abkhazia. It's important to say that. And in the Gal district, I spent only a couple of weeks, although this to me is the most... Right. When it comes to taking a side and a position as to avoid confusion and as to put on a straightforward message, what's your take on that then?
I think that's the question we need to find the answer on.
It's a very tricky issue. That's something I try to illustrate with my last example of this NGO activity taking place in Abkhazia, directed towards the preservation of the Abkhaz language and the documentation of the Abkhaz language on the surface. But then there is also this agenda to kind of, provide a forum for future leaders of Abkhazia and Georgia. And this, as in my example, is illustrated by this post in Abkhazia, is very often seen as a venue for infiltration, so to say, right? So we should again be conscious about the fact that that NGO vocabularies and activities are as well sensitive issues, even if they are labeled in more or less neutral forms, right? So I'm a bit hesitant towards such formats, and I rather see my job as becoming familiar with the narratives on the two sides, right? I mean, I spent so much time in Georgia that I was really interested in hearing the other part of the story. And at first I wasn't even sure if it was possible for me with my Georgian background to spend time in Abkhazia. That's why I went to Abkhazia for 3 weeks in 2016, so before my longer stay, as to find out whether people would constantly, in a way, confront me with my Georgian past. And I speak some Georgian, but only very poor Russian. So I needed to kind of, make inquiries whether I could be there without constantly being confronted with my Georgian past and being conceptualized as a traitor also. And this was not at all the case, I have to say. The interesting question always is what happens to mistrust after a revolution, for example, after the Rose Revolution. And here in Georgia, I found it very interesting that before, mistrust, among the potential revolutionaries, before the revolution was widely shared. It was part of the good tone to mistrust the government. But when Saakashvili and his fellows came to power, very soon, people who observed votes, for example, became ministers or part of the apparatus. That caused a big crisis in the NGO sector, of course, because in a way people were co-opted and part of government strategies. And also there was this tendency, I would say, and you could correct me if I'm wrong, there was this tendency to kind of emphasize state building and emphasize trust of the citizens towards state building, and at the same time to discredit the mistrust of citizens toward what the state does actually, right? And this in a way also contributed, from my reading, from my understanding, to the very fact that this revolutionary project, like so many revolutionary projects, ended into something resembling a dictatorship. Not really a dictatorship, but taking on certain forms and features of that, right? Because mistrust was not allowed anymore. And if we look at this on a larger level, we see that mistrust is part of most constitutions, I would say all constitutions of democratic societies, French Revolution, French Constitution, English Constitution, American Constitution, it's all based on this assumption that the state, right, and people working for the state could be drawn into a certain dynamics that is beyond people's reach. And that this dynamic needs to be mistrusted and needs to be controlled. There need to be certain mechanisms of control installed. And it's based on mistrust, and it's based on the institutionalization of mistrust, not on the blaming of mistrust. And what I see happening nowadays is a shift in the political discourse. There is always this emphasis on trust. Trust building here and there, right? And mistrust is totally discredited because it is equaled with populist movements. And these populist movements, of course, they are now haunting Europe and the United States and many other places. And it's always this kind of equation that people don't trust. They don't trust the media, they don't trust the political mainstream, and they hit the street and it's bad, and we need to do something about that, and we need to find ways to convert this mistrust into trust, which completely ignores actually the potential of mistrust on the one hand, and secondly, my argument is that when you suppress mistrust, only then it becomes very dangerous. Or then it does in fact become very dangerous.
Florian, I have two questions. Thank you for your presentation. The first one is about the concept that was discussed already. Is mistrust cause or is it effect, or is it both, depending on the context? Yeah. So in Georgia, you know Barbara Christoph's book about the metamorphosis of Leviathan and facets of powerfulness or powerlessness, that creating insecurity can become a very good tool for those who have the power. So, cause or effect. The second question is on you as an anthropologist, and I'm asking you as a historian. So what you presented so far was a part of the book where you presented certain observations, impressions. So where is the anthropologist reflecting about his role in this process? Is it coming in another section of the book, or is it something, because you try to do it with the awareness about the language. And I think this is a very good tool, because this is also where you deconstruct the use, the narratives that are inscribed in certain narratives by language. Yeah, so this is a very good element to the, but as the actively working researcher, is there any strategy that you follow or that you include in your book project?
Thank you. Well, I would disagree that self-reflection is absent from this chapter. I would say that it's rather pronounced here, not in an explicit analytical way, but it's through my perceptions and my notes that my stance towards the environment I'm encountering becomes apparent, right? And it's people explaining certain things to me, like for example an icon. And this is this very process of translation that we are witnessing as anthropologists, translating between concepts, translating between perceptions of the world. So I would say that I, as an author, I'm quite inscribed in the text, and that subjectivity cannot be deduced from that. That's my response to your second question. The first question is mistrust the cause or the effect. I would say it is mostly the effect. It is mostly a symptom of something. It can be in certain political instances politically opportune to actually foster that and to play on that and to kind of foster insecurity, actually, because insecurity and mistrust, they are deeply interrelated, of course. If there is security, there is no mistrust, but also no trust, of course, because if you are deeply secure and sure about something, you don't need to trust. Right? So I mean, trust and mistrust both depend on insecurity and not knowing precisely, you know, what's going on and what is predictable and what not. It is always a bit tricky when it comes to taking mistrust as an essential feature of people or of cultures, because in most cases that's also something I'm developing in my book. I would argue that mistrust is part of an othering strategy. So what do I mean with that? When I say that somebody is mistrustful, I'm othering this person. I'm saying that this person is an alien, that there is a problem with this person. Because mistrust always entails this perception of a problem, right? So if I say this person is kind of deeply saturated by mistrust, I'm problematizing this person. And the same applies, of course, also to societies. In the very worst sense, for example, that's something that the American political scientist Francis Fukuyama does. He has a book on trust from 1995, where he is separating the world, actually, and he has only two categories. One is high trust societies and one is low trust societies. And for him, high trust, the presence of high trust in societies, directly translates into success. Political success, economic success, more democracy, more free market, better business. And so, on the other hand, when he detects less trust or the lack of trust as being a characteristic feature of society, that's an indicator of failure. And I would say that in a way it comes in a colonial or post-colonial framework, right? That so often, especially when it comes to post-Soviet or post-socialist societies, mistrust is attached with them and is attached to them. And at the same time, this means that these are minor societies. They have a problem, right? And people from the West could come and teach them how to build confidence building methods, for example. It always entails this position of somebody who is in a more comfortable position because he or she stems from a high trust society and is in a position to provide support for those, who are in the poor position to live in societies that are apparently, allegedly associated with the absence of trust or a not so strong articulation of trust.